everyone, and welcome to the 30th episode of Exploring the Motherland African Unity in the Face of Western Fragility. If you are new to this show, the purpose of Exploring the Motherland is to promote the message of Q2A. And if you are new here, you are wondering what is the message of Q2A and purpose. And the purpose of Q2A is to promote critical infrastructure and economic development for the African diaspora and the African continent as a whole. We do this through our four main strategies. That would be medical, cultural engagement, technological innovation, and business. And to further bring the point home of this show, it is to keep you up to date with the current news on the continent and how it relates to our mission. And it's a way to bring a cohesive message and to show you how things are moving on the continent, and boy are they moving. I mean, this is a very, very exciting times we're in. All the news developments, especially in South Africa, we're going to cover today, especially what is happening in America as it pertains to the continent as a whole, and how the African continent is coming together and in response to what is going on in the West. So let me not rant on. I forgot to say that I was going to, miss a show last Friday. I was out of the town and I am back now. So let's start. White South Africans rally at U.S. Embassy in support of Trump. A group of white South Africans gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria, showing support for former President Donald, now elected President Donald Trump. The protesters, numbering in hundreds, carried signs that read, "Thank God for President Trump." Sorry for my laughter. This is kind of a joke. And voiced their concerns over what they see as racist policies by the South African government, which they claim discriminate against white minorities. William Petzer, one of the organizers of the protest, addressed the crowd saying, "We just want to say to America and to the West, despite the foreign policy decisions in the South African government has made over the past 2 decades, the West still has a friend here in South Africa." A resident and protester spoke about the current state of the country, stating, "Unfortunately, the truth of the last 30 years is that we have a divided country where government policies have positioned South Africa as a fractured nation, corrupting the concept of peace and reconciliation." Trump said land was being expropriated from Afrikaners, basically white Dutch South Africans, which the order referred to as racially disfavored landowners. When no land has been taken under the law, Trump also announced a plan to offer Afrikaners refugee status in the U.S. They are only one part of South Africa's white minority. And I will put all the links to the videos and to the articles in the chat.
We're advocating for Donald Trump and Elon Musk to have a look into the country and to the political stance what's happening here. With regards to the government corruption that's happening, I think most of the country, I love my country and I love the diversity that we have. You can see I've got South African socks on. I support my country and my country supports me.
Fortunately, the truth of the 30 years is that we have a divided country that focus on a point where government is literally placing policy and positioning South Africa as a divided nation. And in that in itself, it corrupts in different levels. It brings the concept of peace and reconciliation.
Isn't it funny? They're talking about a fractured nation. They're talking about their country when, if you know your history, white South Africans are not indigenous to South Africa, and they got there by the way of colonialism. Excuse me, I'm getting back into the swing of things. All right, next video. And then I'll give my critique and relevant points to this.
Now, sick and tired of all these farm murders, and we are here once again in front of the American Embassy to show our disgust in our government that has now gone ahead with the approval of Section 25 yesterday. And we want the international community to take note that they are legalizing theft, property theft.
We've had outreaches of over 17,000 South Africans expressing interest in becoming refugees in the United States of America.
And are they all Afrikaans?
Well, to be honest with you, how do you test an Afrikaner? I've got an English name and an English surname, but I know if we start conversing in Afrikaans, you will hear that I'm a native speaker. I grew up Afrikaans, went to an Afrikaans primary school, high school. I'm a product of the Rand Afrikaans University. So, how are we fully going to define that? I don't know if they're all Afrikaans. Most of the emails I received were in English, and most of them were on behalf of their families. So up and about the number that I have mentioned, which is well over 17,500, we can time that by about 4 if we look at families and added family members. At this stage, we're estimating about 50,000 people reached out to us in the last 2 days, warm bodies that would like to move to the United States from South Africa. And that's shocking.
So that might actually be how many with their families?
Well, we're saying 50,000 with their families, because we're talking about a figure of 17,500 that have reached out to us. But there's no way of quantifying this. Further to that, this is honestly hot off the press. This happened at 5 p.m. US time on the East Coast that we got this news, or that this news broke. This news broke in South Africa during the nighttime of Saturday morning. So we've got no further information other than the executive order. We don't know how it's going to be implemented. What are the scale and scope of that? How are we going to define Afrikaners? That is all information that we are still waiting for. As the South African Chamber of Commerce in the US, we have reached out to the US mission in South Africa. We wrote a letter to the Charge d'Affaires. As you know, the US ambassador to South Africa returned early January to inquire as to the process that would be followed to firstly get South Africans onto a list somewhere, and then secondly, what would be the criteria? How would they adjudicate that? What's the process that will be followed to resettle South Africans to the United States? So at this stage, there's not much that we can share. We know that the impact's going to be severe, and we know that the overwhelming number that have expressed interest will only grow in the coming weeks and days.
Some are actually upset and don't want to be, say, what we Afrikaners, we're staying, we don't want to be associated with that. And as you say, other people see it as an opportunity. So people view it differently.
Well, I think what we have pleaded with our South African brothers and sisters is to at least maintain decorum and respect for one another. Both you and I are South Africans that are no longer resident within South Africa. And we should not denounce those that have got the desire to join us in other parts of the world. At the same time, we respect those that decide to stay because South Africa is an amazing country. It's the country of our birth. That is the country where we all would like to be. And we miss it every single day of our lives. Africa is us more than what we are still in Africa. But we want to at least allow those that have come to a juncture in which they have said, our futures and our strategic direction does not align with where South Africa is at this stage. And a very easy way to explain it. I wasn't born in Nelspruit. I love to say that I wasn't from Nelspruit, but I was definitely born to be in Nelspruit. I came to the US.
Make Afrikaners great again. That was Walter handing out caps to all white crowd. Honey, Walter is a 52-year-old cattle farmer in the Western Cape province. He said it is the first time we've seen in my lifetime. It's the first time we've seen in my lifetime that a foreign president stands up for the Afrikaner people like what we've seen him do. I'm referring to Donald Trump, of course. So we have to support this. Now, he handed out Make Afrikaners Great Again caps to the all-white crowd, which included bikers and black leather fans of local Bulls rugby team and farmers wearing traditional beige shirts and shorts with leather boots. Less than 100 kilometers, 62 miles from here, my uncle and aunts were brutally attacked, and my uncle died in hospital after being in emergency care for about 3 weeks. My aunt is still in a wheelchair.
All right, you could listen to the sister's analysis, but I want to move on just for time's sake. It's just funny, the parallels now. I just thought of this. We're a minority in the West. Some of our people don't want to leave, but they're going to kick us out. And now they're a minority in our land, and they're going to get kicked out, but some of them don't want to leave, but they know that all the resources and wealth and prosperity is in Africa. So they are, I just see the parallels. Trust me, we're going to be talking about this and it's going to all make sense. Trust me, because this is literally everything reversing. The curse is reversing in that book that we all believe. And, for the sake of it being the QTUA broadcast, I won't go any further, but you all know what I'm talking about. This is an example of how America and the West have failed their own attempts to keep the status quo. Trump continues to fail at diplomacy and continues to burn bridges between the United States and South Africa and all other African countries. Trump's support from the white South Africans while on stolen land shows their inevitable demise. They are desperate to hold on to whatever influence and power they once had through colonialism. As you were hearing, they're talking about using tropes like racial discrimination and a divided, fractured nation, when all of that was caused by their own ancestors and all of their brutality to take and steal land and to uphold it with brute force and apartheid and slavery. But now it's funny how they're all fragile about, our people in Africa starting to stand up to colonialism and starting to kick out Western entities and foreigners who no longer respect their sovereignty or their plight or don't want to help or do strategic relationships to help foster their own sovereignty and the prosperity of the natural born Africans who have a right to that land, who are indigenous to the land. Just saying. Trump and his supporters are losing because they lack the tact to garner, as I said, to garner beneficial and strategic relationships in Africa. Furthermore, they are being cut off not just from China and Russia, but now Africa. Henceforth, their critical infrastructure and economic future is about to crumble throughout all in the West. And Brother Richard Long asked earlier, are these people trying to take Trump up on his offer to immigrate? I'm glad you asked that. White South Africans turned down Trump's immigration offer. And the article reads, white South Africaners turned down Trump's immigration offer. Groups representing some of South Africa's white minority responded Saturday to a plan by President Donald Trump to offer them refugee status and resettlement in the United States by saying, thanks, but no thanks. The plan was detailed in an executive order Trump signed Friday that stopped all aid and financial assistance to South Africa as punishment for what the Trump administration said were rights violations by the government against some of its white citizens. Afrikaners are descended from mainly Dutch, but also French and German colonial settlers. That's putting it lightly. More likely, colonizers and imperialists who first arrived in South Africa more than 300 years ago. Again, more than 300 years ago. They were not indigenous to this land. They speak Afrikaans, a language derived from Dutch that developed in South Africa, and are distinct from other white South Africans who come from British or other backgrounds. Our members work here and want to stay here, and they are going to stay here, said Dirk Herman, chief executive of Afrikaner Trade Union. Solidarity, which says it's represented around 2 million people. We are committed to build a future here. We are not going anywhere. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, spokesperson, said, South Africa is a constitutional democracy. We value all South Africans, black and white. The assertion that Afrikaners face arbitrary deprivation and therefore need to flee the country of their birth is an assertion devoid of all truth. Whites in South Africa still generally have a much better standard of living than blacks more than 30 years after the end of apartheid system of white minority rule in 1994. Despite being a small minority, whites own around 70% of South Africa's private farmland.
We start with South Africa, which is locked in a diplomatic spat with the United States. After freezing aid over the alleged land confiscations, President Donald Trump has offered South Africa's white population a resettlement offer in the United States. However, white South Africans have turned down Trump's offer. Donald Trump has signed an executive order to cut nearly $440 million of financial assistance to South Africa. The order cites disapproval of South Africa's land policy and its genocide case at the International Court of Justice against Washington's ally, Israel. Not just this, it also provides for resettlement in the US of Afrikaners in South Africa as refugees, who it says are victims of unjust racial discrimination. Afrikaners are mostly white descendants of early Dutch and French settlers who own most of the country's farmland. However, even the pro-Afrikaner groups, which lobbied Trump's previous administration on their cause, have rejected Trump's offer and have said they do not want to move.
we have to state categorically, we don't want to move elsewhere. We are not going to ask our children now to move to another country. The fact is, our ancestors worked hard to make sure that we as a people are formed on the southern tip of Africa.
Worked hard in what aspect? Worked hard to completely, take and steal land and uphold your rule through brutality, slavery, and apartheid. I mean, if that's what you call working hard, they've been doing it in overtime. They've been working overtime, but now it seems that they're all about to be laid off and terminated.
Africa, we're not going to disrespect that. We also have the interests of future generations in mind. We also have to make sure that our culture is transferred to future generations.
We may disagree with the ANC, but we love the country. As in any community, there are individuals who wish to immigrate, but the repatriation of Afrikaners as refugees is not a solution for us. We want to build a future in South Africa.
Trump's move to sanction South Africa, a key US trading partner in Africa, came after he and his South African-born advisor Elon Musk have accused Pretoria's black leadership of having an anti-white stance. At the center of the row is South Africa's recently signed land expropriation law that allows the government to seize land without compensation under some circumstances. White minority in South Africa own more than 70% of the land, though the government says the land will not be forcefully expropriated. The Trump administration has accused it of conducting human rights violations. But the portrayal of the white minority as a downtrodden group that needed to be saved has surprised most South Africans. Many within the community say that they are not facing any issue which would want them to leave their country.
If you haven't got any problems here, why would you want to go? Hasn't been any really bad taking over of land. The people are carrying on like normal. And, what are you going to do over there? Are they going to pay for the equipment and the seed and the land and the ground? And how are you going to pay it off? You're going to start right from scratch again? I wouldn't.
Meanwhile, the South African government, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, has called it ironic that Trump's executive order makes provisions for refugee status in the US for a group in South Africa that remains among the most economically privileged. It has accused the US President Trump of amplifying misinformation. Amid the row of land seizure, the US is also boycotting the G20 foreign ministerial meet in Johannesburg this month. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called South Africa's G20 agenda anti-American. Ramaphosa responded to US aid cuts and G20 snub by warning the US against bullying South Africa. He also said that he will be sending out envoys to the capitals of various nations across the world to promote Pretoria's G20 agenda. While the row escalates, will white South Africans' response calm Trump down? Or will his anti-Pretoria policies continue? Now, for more on this, we have with us Sayanda Sishiwigzil, a political commentator and journalist joining us live from Johannesburg. Thank you for being with us, Sayanda.
Thank you, Addison, and good afternoon to all of the First Post listeners.
Ayanda, what are the key reasons behind white South Africans, Afrikaners in particular, rejecting Donald Trump's offer of resettlement in the US, despite his claims of addressing discrimination?
As you said so eloquently in your intro, people here are comfortable. White people own 70% of the land. Economically, they are owning most and in control of most of the economy in this country. White people in this country enjoy 8% unemployment, which means majority of white people are employed. If you look at commercial farming, most commercial farms are actually owned by who? By the white minority in this country. This is because of the history of apartheid that we had, where ownership was transferred from Black people to the white minority, which meant that the majority of Black people could not own land, we could not own property, nor could we farm on that property without that land being owned by somebody who was white. This has resulted in a lot of businesses, especially mines, being owned by the white minority. This is why we see them actually economically comfortable. So I would not think that majority of white people would want to leave the comforts of living in suburbia, the comforts of living close to the economy. If you look at where Black people currently stay right now, we do not enjoy the same housing as our counterparts do. We actually live on the fringes of historically what was called townships, which still exist to this day. We do not have access to 70% of the land. We are actually 32.19% unemployment in this country. And if you look at the actual figures of that, when we look at those who are not in education or in employment or in training, that number shoots up to 47%. So almost half of this country is unemployed. And if you look at the statistics, majority of those people are Black.
And Nyanda, how is the US cutting funding to South Africa in response to this land expropriation law to impact the country's economy and its diplomatic relations?
It definitely does impact the diplomatic relations. But I think that there is something that has to be said here, and that's our relations with the United States were going to be impacted well before Donald Trump entered as in his second term. If you remember, we took Israel, which is the ally to the United States, to the International Court of Justice for genocide. And as it currently stands right now, the International Court of Justice has legally said that what has been going on in Gaza is actually a genocide, which means that Israel is actually responsible for a genocide, and its allies, those who are allied to Israel, are going to the United States to spread misinformation and disinformation about the laws that we have in this country, and also exaggerating certain issues such as farm murders without actually paying particular attention to the fact that statistically only 1% of these murders happen on farms, and of those people who are killed, it is majority Black people, citing the recent farm murder that happened where 2 Black women passed away, and they are and those who were allegedly part of that murder are now on trial. And so we are seeing a misrepresentation of information that has taken place, which has then resulted in the misinformation and disinformation campaign. And now when we have these right-wing senators such as Mark Rubio, who has a very strong relationship, by the way, and has met with AfriForum, as well as senators such as Senator Ted Cruz, as well, who has met with minority rights-based organizations such as AfriForum, and has actually said some of the rhetoric that has been spread and the misinformation and disinformation, and quite frankly, the lies that have been told about the Expropriation Act as well, that has been repeated throughout the years by these right-wing leaders who are now in powerful positions in the United States. So I'm not surprised that this is actually happening. What is shocking to me is now the turnaround that has come from these minority-based organizations saying that they want people to stay, saying that no, actually they are not spreading misinformation, when the result of their misinformation and disinformation is exactly this: the cutting of funds from PEPFAR and USAID, and the devastating results that it's going to have for us. We will be fine here and we will be covered because, as you know, PEPFAR only makes up 17% of the health budget, which means that, you know, other NGOs, they will suffer, but salaries and that will be paid for. But other countries, such as Uganda.
All right, you could watch the rest of that video. I believe I provided that earlier in the chat. Trump has tried to embolden white South Africans by gaslighting the South African government on the basis of racial discrimination. However, in reality, whites in South Africa are there due to colonialism and apartheid. They are critical over a land reform initiative that now challenges their colonial conquests of the past and their privileges under that colonial conquest of the past. Without a doubt, their illegitimacy to rule and have power in Africa is in jeopardy as a whole, as we see the Sahel, the Alliance of Sahel states kicking out the French, and basically all the French colonies are, ceasing to exist. All the Western rule that once, impoverished and, completely divided Africa is now being changed and reversed. While South Africans know that the continent of Africa is where all the resources and good land is. Therefore, they do not want to leave, and Trump's dog whistle has failed. Again, basically, his cultural engagement strategy, just for the purposes of our strategies, has failed, because now the West looks weak and looks fractured and divided, because the remaining white South Africans want to stay in South Africa, and they don't want to move to the U.S. because they probably know that the U.S.'s time is up and its influence is up, and the West as a whole is pretty much done. So they know that Africa is the future, and they'll do anything to try to stay and remain in Africa. Western countries and their descendants cannot come together effectively and culturally engage on their strategy to remain in power. This signifies their impending inevitable decline in Africa and the world. And this is the next article. Well, this didn't have an article. I was trying to find an article for this commentary, but this just is a response to what basically Cyril Ramaphosa and the South African government has into responding to Trump's ploy. And also, the more important video that I want us to watch is the South Africa land reform and the history of the farmland that was stolen in Africa by, from our people, and why it's important to reinstitute this policy in order to get our land back and in order to give us economic progression in South Africa, our people and the diaspora as a whole.
And for our last story, we are talking again about the Trump trouble for Africa. US President Donald Trump has sparked a bitter feud within Southern Africa. He has cut all funding to South Africa, alleging that its government is confiscating land of white farmers. Not just this, he has also offered white South Africans a resettlement offer in the United States. The offer has caught everybody off guard. It has led to South Africans across all races mocking Trump's idea, with some calling it straight out of the president's fantasy. Watch our next report to see some such reactions to Trump's South Africa proposal.
It hasn't been a month since Donald Trump took charge as the new US president. But his first few days in office have been enough to send shockwaves around the world. From sweeping aid cuts to tariff wars, thousands of deportations, and some baffling takeover plans.
With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America.
The US president seemed to have gone frenzied against all odds. He has picked a bone with quite a few countries, and a major one with South Africa. Trump has cut all funding to South Africa and has accused the Ramaphosa government of doing some terrible things. As per Trump, South Africa is confiscating land and is treating certain classes very badly. The reasoning of his argument? It's the newly signed land seizure law by President Cyril Ramaphosa, which, as per the US president, is anti-white. The law allows the South African government to seize farmland without compensation only under some circumstances. White South Africans own over 70% of farmland in South Africa. Their population, just over 8%. But as per Trump, white South Africans are victims of human rights violations. But to punish the South African government, Trump didn't just stop at aid cuts. He also brought a plan to resettle white South Africans in the United States. And that's where everybody drew a line. Even white South Africans have rejected Trump's proposals. The groups who once urged Trump to take up their cause have also been caught a bit off guard. While for some other South Africans, Trump's odd proposals are straight out of a fantasy or illusion.
To me, I think it's either an illusion or a fantasy on Trump to obviously gain more momentum.
You see with Trump, hey, there's a lot of things when it comes to Trump. I feel like Trump is just trying to scare people. I think he wants power.
Some say Donald Trump is on a mission to trap white South Africans. Some believe the man misleading Trump on South Africa is none other than his close ally and South Africa-born tech billionaire Elon Musk,
This goofball.
who has for years slammed the Ramaphosa government over land reforms and even claimed that they have been a victim of genocide without any evidence.
So I think he's got the wrong end of the stick. And AfriForum and the Afrikaans community is not going to fall for that trap, you know.
Personally, I feel like Trump doesn't know anything about this. I feel like Elon Musk is pushing him behind to say there's something there, go look at it. Because why all of a sudden interest in SA after all these years?
Trump's proposals have also sparked reactions on social media. Some South African users have labeled Trump's ideas as lame, and some are calling them funny and ridiculous.
Link to the article, link to the video if you want to check it out. And this other video, I believe, is the more important video that explains the land history in South Africa.
Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, correcting the record on Trump's South Africa misinformation.
They're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and the persistent myth of persecuted white farmers in South Africa. I'm Kevin Hurton, and this is The Take.
My name is Lebohang Diepolopkepu. I am in Johannesburg. I am a feminist economist and academic. I teach, I research, and I write extensively. And you're catching me from Johannesburg. It's hot, it's sunny. It has its own challenges with load shedding, with Wi-Fi shedding, but it's where I call home for now.
So, Lebohang, I want to start with just a few statistics that might provide some useful context to this discussion. The first one is, in South Africa, around 70% of farmland is still owned by white South Africans, yet they make up just 7% of the population. Think about that. 70% of the land owned by 7% of the population. And the other statistic is that South Africa has the worst inequality in the entire world. So is there a direct connection between these two thoughts? Can you trace many of South Africa's current problems back to just who owns the land? Because that's such a big part of wealth generation, correct?
Absolutely. So, for example, how much cattle you have, how much livestock you have, how much. It's also to do with autonomy, the ability to feed yourself, and sovereignty over your own movement. Where now many people in agricultural spaces and in rural areas, African people, are viewed as trespassers.
First of all, when a white man comes and leases the farm, first of all, you must remove your cattle. All of them. He doesn't want the cattle. Nothing. All of them. So maybe it's the criteria they are using to remove all the black people on the farms.
And of course, this fiction that has also begun to take some currency of farm killings, and that these are predominantly white farmers being killed by African people, which is not true. And the statistics show again that there's a huge amount of danger of African people being killed in rural areas.
Yeah.
Being either mistaken for monkeys, being accused of stealing, and so on and so on.
So how did we get here? How, more than 30 years since the end of apartheid, do white South Africans still own this much of the country?
So we can trace it certainly to the moment of settler colonialism, the moment of invasion, the moment of displacement. So that goes back to 1652. Jan van Riebeeck, who and his band of merry men and some women who arrived from different places, primarily the Netherlands, and then of course France, Germany, and a small smattering of British settlers as well. And of course, what this meant is not only the displacement of people from their own land, but also the displacement of people from their own aspirations, from their own sense of personhood. So the only relationship for many years, for over 150 years, that the settlers had with African people, the indigenous majority, was one of laborer. So we should take it back to the first settlement, which was in what is now called Cape Town. It was a slave state. It was a slave province. People were being taken and enslaved in this slave colony. We were then also placed in these settlements, very similar to what happened to Native Americans and the reservations. It was really them trying to pretend that these little Bantustans, as they were called, were actually semi-autonomous, semi-independent states. They were not. And then, of course, again, the only relationship that we had then with our land, which was displaced in, was working white people's land, working the land that had been stolen from us. That is really the sort of relationship that has continued to this day. And then when you add to that, the very deliberate spatial plan.
Just to stop and, us working our stolen land that they stole from us, that is, biblical, but I'll go on.
Planning, which of course has vested most of the really good stuff in the hands of this white settler minority. So including the best schools, the best agricultural land, the best homes as well. And how, of course, African people were then placed again into these small places called townships. And the only relationship between townships and the cities, which were formerly white spaces, white zones, was, of course, our capacity to travel there as workers, right, as laborers. So it's a really toxic, perverse, ongoing system of exclusion, of marginalization, of dehumanization, of depersonalization of African people. So no surprise, Kevin, that fast forward, 100 years, 150 years, that we now have these deep and embedded inequalities because it was designed that way.
So last December, South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, signs this new law meant to help bridge the divide. It's called the South African Expropriation Act. What does this law actually do?
Well, it's really supposed to really enable the states to be able to take control of this many pieces of land that have not been used so many years, sometimes decades. It's supposed to firstly put in place a whole slate of public interest land use as well, which includes, for example, if land is needed for housing, if land is needed for a hospital, if land is needed for schooling, states should be able to appropriate that. But this is part of our, South Africa's commitment to land reform. It doesn't really talk much about expropriation without compensation. It's really talking about equity. It's really also trying to talk about land that's been abandoned. It's been talking about land whose market value has been so diminished over the last maybe decades that it hasn't been bought by anyone. And this is the sort of land that has become available. It's really not.
Prophet Templeton, I'm glad that you said that. What most people don't know is that most American white farmers are about to lose their farms. They need these Dutch farmers to replace the American farmers. And it's funny how, going back in the history, in American history, all the farmland that was stolen in America by from Black Americans, and all, also was done in South Africa as well. As I said before, everything is being reversed.
That really not that radical. There's a whole series of legislations, Kevin, and viewers and listeners, that have been in place since 1994 that speak to the rights of tenants, the rights of farm workers, security of tenure, for example, and said that 30% of land was supposed to be redistributed back to the African people by 1999. That hasn't happened. So what this piece of legislation is trying to do is to try to give some life, some impetus and put some nuts and bolts into what has been theoretically agreed upon, but the implementation under the African National Congress, incredibly slow and sometimes very, very hesitant.
We'll have more with Lebohang after a break.
Passed a bill into law.
This is racial discrimination. And unfortunately, this actually predates this particular term. This dates back to his first term. There's a sort of a small special interest group or Afrikaner interest group, which you probably are aware of now, Africora, who actually had secret meetings with the Trump on the first administration. And they've been creating this whole narrative globally of Afrikaner victimhood.
The South African government has passed a bill into law that threatens private property rights in South Africa, that makes expropriation without compensation possible, and this is a serious threat, and we want international criticism directed at the South African government for this attack against private property rights.
And it really comes from a place of what I call white malice, and also complete white dishonesty. So it's this idea that they are this oppressed people, and it's very similar to it's almost a very Zionist type of victimhood. One that suggests that they're the only oppressed people. It's very ahistorical. It's completely dishonest.
White South Africans make up about 8% of the population, but they hold about 3/4 of privately owned land in the country. In contrast, only 4% of privately held land is owned by Black South Africans, who make up nearly 80% of the country's 60 million residents.
It completely negates the way that African people have been displaced from this country, from our own country, and so on. So, as we know, the old adage that anything when privilege is challenged always feels like an inconvenience. It always feels like being victimized when you've had power for that amount of time.
Right. Yeah, Trump said terrible things are happening in South Africa. But this isn't coming out of nowhere. The right has been focused on this issue for a while.
Yeah.
The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has begun, and you may have seen this in the press, seizing land from his own citizens without compensation because they are the wrong skin color. That is literally the definition of racism. Racism is what our elites say they dislike most. Donald Trump is a racist, they say. But they paid no attention to this at all.
And of course, there's Elon Musk, who is of South African descent and is now a close advisor to Trump. He's accused the South African government of allowing a white genocide against white farmers. Elon Musk is not the only person with roots in South Africa who has the president's ear right now.
Yeah.
There's also Peter Thiel and David Sachs, who have been called the PayPal Mafia back in the day.
Yeah.
Thiel is a major Trump donor and Sachs is a leading fundraiser. What do you think we need to understand about their connections to South Africa and the role that they might be playing here?
Yeah. So there's like 1, 2, 3, there's like 4 of these former South Africans with all the grievance politics that they carry with them, who are clearly part of this kind of strange implication that South Africa suddenly has in the midst of the Trump administration. And then, of course, these are all people who, for the most part, have renounced their allegiances to South Africa. I think, to my knowledge, that Elon Musk still has citizenship here. Peter Thiel and David O. Sachs, for all intents and purposes, are now entirely Americanized in terms of having been completely radicalized into right-wing thinking, having a completely ahistorical and really delinking themselves from any of the problems that have arisen in South Africa as a result of their own deep complicity as well, or, whether historically, whether generationally.
Yeah, I usually don't play a video for this long, but I believe it's very important. So maybe I'll play another minute of it, and I'll make sure I put that link for this video because it's very important. Sister's breaking it down very eloquently and making it all cohesive and giving us the history as to why they are now, their backs are against the wall. They feel their privilege leaving them. As she said, it's an inconvenience to have, your power that you stole and, have used brute force to uphold. It's an inconvenience to them. So now all they could do is stoke propaganda and hope that they could remain in power. But the world is turning against them. They're tired of it. And again, our brothers and sisters are coming together to create beneficial, strategic relationships that help bring back economic progression and critical infrastructure for Africa and the African diaspora as a whole. But let me play the rest of this video, and then I'll put, not the rest, a couple more minutes, and I'll put the link in the chat.
But their own deep complicity in both what is happening here in South Africa historically, and of course what is happening with the rise of the right in the United States and across as well. Just on a final note, it's not surprising that all of them come from immense privilege as well, Kevin. That's not coincidental.
No.
So these are not people who are, on the ground sweating their brows. These are all the recipients of the very same intergenerational unearned privilege that they now accuse an African-led government of trying to put in place for its own people.
Yeah. Part of Trump's executive order was to offer refugee status to white South African farmers, which is just quite a choice, considering everything this administration is doing to keep out and deport refugees from other countries. I mean, it's amazing. What kind of reaction have you seen from white South Africans to this offer? Does anyone want to come to America?
Yeah, maybe 5 people. I mean, people are comfortable, Kevin. I mean, there are very few white folks.
There's been some hilarious videos. Have you seen some of the videos of white South Africans? Yeah.
Dancing and having a great time. I mean, really.
At the pool, like talking about how they're a refugee now.
I'm moving to the USA, bro. Okay, why? Because I just got refugee status, son.
I then need to wash, so I have a dip in our pool, which is used for bathing and drinking as we have no running water. Then I sit down to apply for a job I'm not qualified for and cry when I don't get it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so awful. And also, there's something to be said about this paper bag test of refugee status, which is really sinister.
Yeah.
Particularly at a time when you have, we are watching at a distance, of course, how things played out with at the border with Mexico, for example. How there's no willingness to host Palestinian.
Okay, it's time to move on. Enough about them. Let's talk about us and our people. African Union leaders convened for the summit in Ethiopia. African leaders meeting in Ethiopia this weekend are to launch a new push for slavery and colonial reparations. Yes, I said it. A new push for slavery and colonial reparations, but can expect to be stonewalled by former colonial powers, most of which have ruled out making amends for historical wrongs. While the issue of reparations has gained momentum worldwide, so has the backlash. U.S. President Donald Trump has said he doesn't see reparations happening, and many of Europe's leaders have opposed even talking about it. Oh, gee, I wonder why. From the 15th to the 19th century, at least 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped. It's much more than that, but they're just being generous in this article. Forcibly transported by mostly European merchants and sold into slavery. The debate on reparations needs to address the legacy of colonialism and slavery today, from racism to the economic disparities between Africa and wealthy Western nations.
African leaders meeting at the African Union Summit in Ethiopia are renewing calls for slavery and colonial reparations despite resistance from former colonial powers. While the reparations movement is gaining momentum, leaders in the US and Europe have largely dismissed the idea. At the summit in Addis Ababa, AU leaders aim to define a unified approach, including financial compensation, formal acknowledgements, and policy reforms. Experts argue that Africa's economic struggles, debt crisis, and vulnerability to climate change are rooted in colonial exploitation. Beyond financial payment, reparations could involve land restitution, returning cultural artifacts, and policy changes to address inequalities. The AU has also allied with CARICOM to push for reparations through diplomatic and legal channels.
Give me a second. The audio is pretty low. I'm going to try to find a new video. Just give me 1 second. Just give me 1 second. And yeah, he doesn't see it coming because, you know, they're confounded. Their wisdom has left them. They don't know what's going on. They are, you know, setting themselves up for a trap. They literally have lost all their influence and have basically, you know, everything is reversing. Give me a second. This is me improving. I didn't know that video was going to come out so low. Give me a second, family. Let me see if this video should be good. And let me share this screen for a bit. Give me 1 second. On the
Ivy League
fly.
universities you can get into with a 3.6 GPA.
90 Ministers are streamlining ideas that will guide heads of state in their deliberations on how to reform the African Union and make it stronger. On the agenda for the heads of state, the structure of the AU Commission. Reforms spearheaded by Rwanda suggest reducing the 8 AU commissions, which tackle issues including politics, economics, and social affairs, down to 6. The commissions for political affairs and peace and security may be merged, with a view to make the AU Commission leaner and less expensive.
Strong accountability and performance systems are essential. Proposals for
Whatever, that's not what I wanted, but I believe what the other video I have highlights basically that other article. Give me 1 second.
Voting for the African Union chairperson had just concluded at the 38th Ordinary Summit taking place in Addis Ababa. 4 candidates were fronted: Kenya, the Congo, as well as Madagascar, all fronted candidates. But Sophie Mukana has breaking news in for us just now. It's neither one of those candidates that had prevailed, although, of course, the build up towards it was that Raila Odinga of Kenya was the front runner. But it's another country on the continent that I had not mentioned that's through. Sophie? Mohammed Yusuf Ali Yusuf is the successor. Where is he from?
He's from Djibouti. It's part of East Africa. It's part of the Horn of Africa. As we indicated earlier on this morning on other shows, we did point out that East Africa has got 2 candidates from Kenya, Raila Odinga, in Djibouti, and the southern region, that is SADC, had a candidate from Madagascar. Now, clearly, during so we are waiting to see whether Djibouti leading, have they been able so to support them, because now he was endorsed by
candidates and hopefully do well in that election. Djibouti really is a country that has not.
That's just basically talking about the different issues. But the next article I have is definitely about the reparations, but I put the link to the article for what the main point is of reparations for the African descendants and African people. But also I have basically elucidated the point of what our brothers and sisters in the continent are trying to do. Thank you for bearing with me. I am getting back into the swing of things. African nations see now more than ever the importance to unite. They are now making strategic partnerships to help stimulate economic growth and critical infrastructure. Importantly, they now understand not just getting rid of colonialism isn't enough. The West needs to be held accountable for their actions. Because of their actions, Africa hasn't been able to thrive economically. The time is now to come together and to work out effective cultural engagement strategies to help Africa thrive. But I'm moving on because this is the more important point, and the volume should be good on this video.
Shifting our focus now to Africa, where countries are uniting to demand reparations from their former colonizers. Yes, you heard that right. African leaders are meeting in Ethiopia this weekend to launch a new push for slavery and colonial reparations. As the African Union prepares for its 38th summit, the central topic will reportedly be a joint push for reparations. African leaders reportedly aim to define a unified vision for reparations, which includes financial compensation, a formal acknowledgement of historical wrongs, and comprehensive policy reforms. Well, the African Union's reparations agenda, adopted in 2023, seeks to address the lasting effects of slavery, as well as colonial exploitation of Africa's economic development and inequality. Beyond financial amends, the leaders are also expected to call for land restitution and the return of cultural artifacts that were looted during colonial rule. Discussions will also focus on combating economic inequality, racism, and Africa's marginalization in global affairs. But the push faces the risk of being stonewalled by former colonial powers, most of which have ruled out making amends for their historical wrongs. While the issue of reparations has gained momentum worldwide, so has the backlash. Many of Europe's leaders have opposed even talking about it. But the unwillingness to talk about it does not change facts. From the 15th to the 19th century, at least 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped, forcibly transported by, and mostly to European merchants, and sold into slavery then. African Union's Economic, Social and Cultural Council has said that the debate on reparations needs to be addressed. The council has said that the legacy of slavery that we see today in the form of racism and economic disparities between Africa and wealthy Western nations, it needs to be addressed. Africa's current debt crisis can also be traced back to African nations being saddled with heavy debts upon independence. Then there's the issue of climate change. It is also linked to colonialism. Africa is responsible for just a fraction of carbon emissions, but its fragile ecosystem have borne the brunt of global warming. And that is why the call for reparations have taken an important dimension today. Advocates of reparations say that they are more than just compensation at this point of time. You see, much of the debate around reparations, particularly in former colonial powers such as Britain and Portugal, focused solely on financial payments. But advocates say that making amends for the past actions can take many forms. African Union's Economic, Social and Cultural Council head, William Caro, has said, and I'm quoting him here, reparations are more than just compensation. It is about ensuring future generations inherit a world that acknowledges their past and propels them towards a brighter future, unquote. But 30 years since the AU's forerunner, the Organization of African Unity issued a declaration demanding reparations. There has been little progress. Just take these examples, for instance. In Portugal, which enslaved more Africans than any other nation, far-right party Chega has proposed charging the president with treason for suggesting there might be a need for reparations. Then in Britain, right-wing populist Nigel Farage has said that Prime Minister Keir Starmer would be weak, and that is if he engaged in talks on this issue of reparations. Lastly, in France, President Emmanuel Macron has ruled out reparations, calling for reconciliation instead. With the former colonizers unwilling to engage in a debate, is reparation and the justice of that possible ever?
Shocking. Shocking that they're gonna, threaten the president with treason for even, suggesting. He didn't even say he would, and we're not surprised with Macron. He's just a sore loser at this point.
Watch TV.
Your Excellency, Chairman, President of Angola, Your Excellency, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Your Excellency, Chairperson of the African Union, and in the interest of time, may I just proceed on established protocol and say, Your Excellencies, my colleague, heads of state, distinguished citizens. It's a privilege to address this historic launch of the African Union theme of the year 2025, and I quote, "Justice for Africans and the people of African descent through reparations," unquote. This moment marks a significant milestone in our collective pursuit of justice, equity, and the long overdue recognition of the historical injustices that continue to shape the lives of Africans and the people of African descent worldwide. At the 37th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the African Union in February 2024, our heads of state and government made a landmark decision to dedicate the year 2025 to the cause of reparatory justice. This decision underscores our collective commitment to addressing the historical injustices and their lingering consequences that have impacted generations of Africans and people of African descent. In alliance with our broader struggle for liberation, unity, and socioeconomic empowerment, as enshrined in Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, a vision for an integrated, peaceful, and prosperous continent. Your Excellencies, the transatlantic slave trade was one of the most heinous crimes against humanity, spanning about 400 years and forcibly displacing more than 12.5 million Africans. It is estimated that at least 2 million of our compatriots perished during the Middle Passage alone. The legacy of this brutal system, along with colonialism, apartheid, genocide, and neo-colonial exploitation, have left deep and enduring scars on the fabric of our societies. Today, the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to face economic disparities, social inequality, systemic discrimination, and racial prejudices. Addressing these challenges require more than just acknowledging them. It demands action. The economic impact of colonialism on Africa has been profound. Historical estimates suggest that the continent lost trillions of dollars in both human and material resources due to colonial exploitation. The forced extraction of wealth, which included minerals, cash crops, and labor, deprived African nations of the capital and infrastructure necessary for sustainable development. Colonial policies intentionally stifled industrial growth, leading to a dependency on foreign economies that persists even till today. The systemic plundering of Africa's natural resources, coupled with the disruption of traditional governance structures, has resulted in lasting consequences, worsening poverty, underdevelopment, and inequality throughout the continent. In November 2023, Ghana hosted the Accra Reparations Conference, a historic gathering that brought together African heads of state, scholars, and representatives of the global African diaspora to advance the reparations movement. This conference reaffirmed the urgent need for comprehensive reparatory justice and laid the foundation for stronger advocacy and policy frameworks. It provided a platform for dialogue on the financial, cultural, and social restitution necessary to address the enduring effects of slavery and colonialism. The outcomes of this conference served as a guiding pillar for our collective efforts moving forward. The 2025 AU theme of the year is therefore a call to galvanize efforts towards reparatory justice. It is an appeal to ensure that the dignity, rights, and well-being of Africans and their descendants are fully restored. Reparations involves not only financial compensation, but also restitution, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition for the abuse of fellow human beings. It is also about truth-telling, historical accountability, and the restoration of agency to those who have been marginalized for centuries. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the call for reparations, while including, extends beyond financial redress to encompass addressing structural inequalities, ensuring educational and economic opportunities, reclaiming cultural heritage, and amplifying the voice of Africa and the diaspora communities on the global stage. Achieving justice requires multi-stakeholder collaboration. Today's pre-launch event serves as a crucial platform for concertedly rolling out constructive consultation, dialogue, and partnership. We welcome the participation of AU member states, regional economic communities, the global African diaspora, civil society organizations, academia, the private sector, and international partners in this transformative endeavor. The African Union Commission, in collaboration with key partners, have developed a concept note and revised the roadmap to guide the implementation of the reparations agenda. This initiative will further the aspirations of Agenda 2063, fostering an Africa that is self-reliant, just, and inclusive. Through this launch, we seek to, among other things, mobilize political will and commitment towards reparatory justice and racial healing, present and discuss the roadmap for implementing the 2025 theme of the year, foster partnerships among AU member states, diaspora communities, and like-minded international allies, engage stakeholders in resource mobilization efforts to support reparations initiatives across Africa, elevate awareness and advocacy to ensure sustained engagement beyond 2025, encourage dialogue and knowledge sharing among experts, policymakers, historians, and affected communities, and finally, to ensure an end to the culture of silence and denial on racism and colonialism. Your Excellency, the work ahead requires a unified voice, a clear strategy, and unyielding commitment. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to working together to develop policies and frameworks that will support reparations efforts across Africa and beyond. We must continue to advocate for stronger legal and institutional mechanisms at the national, regional, and international levels to ensure that reparatory justice for the historical trauma inflicted on global Africa is not just a conversation, but a reality. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I wish to express Ghana's unwavering support for this critical initiative. Let us seize this moment with the determination it deserves as we work together towards a future that is fair, that is just, and equitable for all Africans and people of African descent, and by natural extension, the uplifting of all humanity. I thank you.
Well, there you have it. Things are moving, things are changing. I just want everyone to be encouraged and see why we are needed in the continent, why we need to come together and brainstorm and create economic opportunities for the future generations and building up critical infrastructure that helps progress Africa and our nation as a whole, basically the diaspora and the people on the continent of Africa. And I hope this was informative. Please like, share, and subscribe. Please comment. And I also want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. It was nice doing the show. I forgot to say that I wasn't doing the show last week, but I am back now, and I'm going to be a lot sharper and refined to give you, better content and to show you why Q2A is needed and why your participation is needed to help Africa become great again, for lack of a better term. So I'm out. Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Enjoy the rest of their Shabbat and their weekend and your weekends.